We're going to finish the book of Obadiah today, and we're going to talk about this idea of you get to choose between judgment and deliverance. Choose wisely. We'll talk about that when we come right back. Hi, and welcome to Bible Study with Friends, where our goal is to help you get more impact from your Bible studies. We help you with examples of how to study the Word, how to mark it, and how to apply it to your life. And today I'm here with my friend Kyle Grinstead, and we're going to finish our study in the book of Obadiah. This great book. The first week we talked about how Obadiah really describes a lot of attributes we find in our culture today of this kind of arrogant pride. And then last week we talked about God's actions towards that arrogant pride, and also the pride that spills over into an arrogance towards God's people and a mistreatment of God's people, and very timely when God's people are being attacked. Today we're going to talk about this idea, Kyle, of judgment. Not a subject that a lot of people like to talk about, but the Bible talks about it a lot, and we need to pay attention to the grounds for judgment and what the options are, and we're going to see that today. We're going to do Obadiah between verse 15 and verse 21, the rest of the chapter, and we'll see what it has to say for each of us. You ready to go?
Let's go.
All right. Why don't we read, starting in verse 15, why don't you read 15 and 16 for us?
All right. For the day of the Lord draws near on all the nations. As you have done it, it will be done to you. Your dealings will return on your own head. Because just as you drank on my holy mountain, all the nations will drink continually. They will drink and swallow and become as if they had never existed.
Okay. So give me some observations. What do you get from those two verses?
Oh, yeah, it seems interesting that the way that God portrays the judgment is, as you've done, it will be done to you. So you've treated Israel, you've treated other nations this way, so you're going to get the same thing. I thought that was interesting.
Does that kind of echo in something that's out of the New Testament? The golden rule?
Nothing. Okay, yeah. So the
treat
inverse of
other people the way you want them to treat you.
Yeah.
And that works in the arrogant treatment of other people. God is going to hold you accountable. Now, there's some interesting cross references there. The first word of it is the word for, and that basically means because. Now, if we talked last week in the up to verse 14, in all the things God was going to do in the future, remember the future tense of all those verbs? He will do this, he will do this, he will do this, because of the things you've done in the past in your arrogance and in your arrogant treatment of Israel. And then he goes, verse 15 says, because. Now he's going to do that because the day of the Lord draws near. Now, this is a perfect example of what we've seen. Remember the illustration we did on the first chapter, the first part of the chapter, where we see a prophet who looks at an event. From his vantage point, it looks like one event, but he doesn't see the gaps of time between the events.
Yeah.
So this term, the day of the Lord, is a term that's used throughout the Old Testament by prophets talking about the judgment of God, and it can be the judgment of God in the current situation, but it can also be the final judgment, the great white throne judgment, where he is going to judge the world for a final time. And from the perspective of the prophet, it looks like it's the same issue of God's judgment and the day of God's judgment. That make sense?
That does, yeah.
Because he says, you want to pay attention because the day of the Lord, and we could take that and say, okay, the day of the Lord is when God intercedes in the current situation, and the promise of what he's going to do in the far future with the final judgment. That day of the Lord is going to come, and it's going to come in this context of the way you treat him, the way you treat his grace, the way you treat his people is going to be recompensed back to you. The way you treated them is the way you're going to be treated. I want to give you a couple of interesting cross references here. In this idea of God is going to draw near and he's going to have judgment. The day of the Lord is going to be judgment on all the nations. Now, I want us to look at a couple of verses that talk about that. Turn over to Ezekiel chapter 30, verse 3.
For the day is near, the day of the Lord is near. It will be a day of clouds, a time of doom for the nations.
Okay, that's a perfect case where Ezekiel, as a prophet, says the day of the Lord is near. I see God interfering in the working of man with judgment. And he's also seeing this future judgment on all the nations. And he's seeing that as a single event, just like Obadiah is. Now, the other one is in Isaiah chapter 34, verse 1 and 2, talking about God's judgment on all the nations, when Obadiah is talking about judgment in all the nations right there and right then. So go ahead and read Isaiah 34, 1 and 2.
All right. Come near, O nations, to listen. Pay attention, O peoples. Let the earth hear and all that fills it, the world and all that springs from it. The Lord is angry with all the nations and furious with all their armies. He will devote them to destruction. He will give them over to slaughter.
Now you see how that is another case where the prophet is seeing judgment coming now and judgment coming in the future of all the nations of the world.
Yeah.
From his perspective, Obadiah is saying, hey, Edom and the nations around Edom, you need to be careful of your pride and your arrogant treatment of Israel, because the day of the Lord is here. It's coming. And that future day is going to be of all the nations. So we could take that as an application. How would you take that first phrase of the day of the Lord is coming and he's going to judge all the nations?
Yeah, from the more imminent vantage point, it's the fact that God might continue to have intermediate judgments up until the final judgment, okay, which is maybe a warning to us immediately.
Okay, so it was a warning to Edom and those nations immediately, but it's also a warning to us. Be careful not to read these and just say, oh, this is dusty Old Testament. This is just a dusty old prophet. We got to start to think about, wait a minute now. Am I reacting to the current situation, and am I reacting to God in my relationship with him with arrogance that Edom was showing, because God is going to judge them then and he's going to judge me now and judge me in the future. So we've got past, present, and future tense, all that we need to consider in that first verse. So it goes on with this idea of, as you have done, it will be done to you. There's two really good references. Hosea basically says the same thing. Hosea 10:13 says, God is going to judge you the way you've judged other people. And he's going to treat you that way. But look at Galatians chapter 6. This is a New Testament reference to that. Galatians chapter 6, verse 7.
All right. Do not be deceived. God is not to be mocked. Whatever a man sows, he will reap in return.
So there's that idea of, you can't ignore God. What you sow in your actions, they're going to come back, as he says here, your dealings will return on your own head. So that's that is a principle that we could be thinking about. Wait a minute. How am I treating God's grace in my life? Do I take it for granted? Do I ignore it? Am I arrogant about it that, hey, I deserve it and it's going to be good because no matter what God does, I'm okay? You see what I'm saying? That's like
Yeah.
Edom was doing. Now he says, because just as you drank on my holy mountain, verse 16, all the nations will drink continually. They will drink and swallow. That word swallow, look at the little number
Yeah.
next to the word swallow. It basically means to stagger. You're going to swallow it so much that you're going to stumble and become, look at the end of verse 16, and become as if they had never existed. Now, this is talking about the big party that was thrown that Edom participated in when Israel, his holy mountain, was captured. Remember, we talked last week about Edom had participated in the looting, and they had thrown this big party, and Edom had drunk to the success of the raid and all their loot. And God says, just like you did, it's going to come back on your own head. And you celebrated the fall of my holy hill, Jerusalem, and you drank, and I'm going to let you drink until you are non-existent. And we're going to see that come true. Now, what's the next word in verse 17?
But.
Now, whenever you come across the word but, it's always what is about to come is in contrast to what just was said. You're going to drink and you're going to become as if they never existed. But, and this is a huge verse. This is for me a key verse. Read verse 17 and let's talk about how that applies.
But on Mount Zion there will be deliverance, and it will be holy, and the house of Jacob will reclaim their possession.
Basically, what that is saying, and it's said often, whenever in the Old Testament, Israel being faithless, God is going to judge Israel because Jerusalem, God's holy hill, Zion, those are synonyms, is being conquered. And it's being conquered by a group of people that are arrogant, prideful. We talked about that. But it says that there will be, and this is a great promise for us, there are going to be survivors. And all through the Old Testament, when Israel is being faithless and is going to come under judgment, there is always a faithful remnant. Isaiah calls them the faithful remnant. There are a few people that stay faithful to God. And because of that faithfulness, they receive deliverance. Do you see that in that verse?
Yeah.
So there are
So
going to
there will be
survivors.
deliverance. Yeah.
So if I'm reading this, and I'm talking about studying, and I get what he's talking about here with Jerusalem, but one of the questions I would ask myself is, am I part of the faithful remnant who's going to survive God's judgment with deliverance? Or am I part of the arrogant group that's taking God's grace for granted and mistreating God's people and God's promises? So there's some stopping and thinking going on. That just as the first part of Obadiah talked about our culture today and the application of our culture today, now we're talking about asking ourselves today, am I part of the faithful remnant? Because there's that huge word but. God's going to judge, but there's a group. That makes sense?
Yeah, it does.
Are we seeing that? And how we can take this Old Testament prophet, this dusty Old Testament of the book of Obadiah, and how this can really apply to me, and how I can really ask myself some questions of, am I being faithful even in the midst of the culture around me being judged and going pretty hard on the arrogance of the culture? Am I being a faithful remnant in the culture? Huge question.
Yeah.
Now it goes on. He says there's going to be those, that faithful remnant, who escape. And it will be holy. That is, that faithful remnant in God's holy city. And it talks about us being God's holy city in the New Testament. We're a city on the hill, right? And we are going to be the faithful remnant if we remain faithful and don't fall into this trap of arrogance. Then it goes on, it says, the Mount Zion is going to be holy. The house of Jacob will possess their possessions. Then the house of Jacob will be a fire. Now, Jacob is the southern kingdom. Jacob is Judah and Benjamin, the descendants of Jacob. And Joseph represents the northern kingdom. And he says, the house of Jacob will be a fire that consumes the culture around it, and the house of Joseph a flame, and the house of Esau, the house of Edom, the arrogant people, will be like a stubble that just a little match, and they will set them on fire and consume them, so that there will be no survivor of the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken. Now, what's your reaction to this phrase, the Lord has spoken?
It's like a finality with it.
Yeah. It's saying, God says it, that settles it.
Yeah.
This is a message from God. This isn't just my opinion. This is from God. The Lord has spoken. Pay attention. So if I say, look, God is going to use the faithful remnant of the northern and southern kingdoms to judge Esau with fire, to judge this arrogance with fire. The Lord has spoken. And then we're going to get to the very end here. And I want to ask you your observations. Here's where we're going to get into an example of, we're going to use a map, and I'm going to show you a map here in a second. Let me read 19 and 20, because there's some names we can stumble over here. And I'd rather have me stumble than you stumble. Then those of the Negev will possess the mountain of Esau. Now, he's talking about, this is after Esau burns. Those of the Negev will possess the mountains of Esau. And we know there's a Negev desert. That's modern terminology. And those of the Shephelah, those are, if you look at that little footnote over there, the number 2, those are the highlands. And it says that the southern country is Negev, and the foothills of the highlands is this Shephelah. And they're going to possess the Philistine plain, and also possess the territory of Ephraim and the territory of Samaria, and Benjamin will possess Gilead. That reminds me of, do you remember the old hymn, There is a Balm in Gilead? So Gilead is a real place. And the exiles of this host of the sons of Israel, who are among the Canaanites as far as Zarephath, and the exiles of Jerusalem who are in Sephard, will possess the cities of the Negev. Okay, you're doing a Bible study and you come to these places, and it's really easy just to read through and skip the names and go, oh man, I can't even pronounce that. Skip through it. But it's important to get a feel for where they are. And that's where we'd use a tool of a Bible atlas. And we'd start to look up some of these areas. And we can see how God really has fulfilled this prophecy against Esau and against Edom. And he has fulfilled that in Israel today. Now, I want to share a map. Did you look up any of those names?
No, I did exactly what you said and just passed over them.
We do that all the time. But you can really get some blessings out of stopping and just asking and using the tool of a Bible atlas and look up some of these names. And you'll get some blessing. Let me show you in this map. Okay, can you see that all right?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, some of these names, when it says, here's the Negev right down here, and you could see the Moab is there, Edom is this whole area, See that word Edom down there? Egypt is way off to the southwest. But way up north, it says they're going to get as far as Zarephath. You see the Zarephath way up here? So all the way to the north, all the way down through Ephraim, and over here is Gilead, and all through this area. And it talks about the plains of Philistia, the Philistines, this plain right along this. That's where Gaza is today. So he's really describing the content of modern Israel.
Yeah.
All the way from the Golan Heights, Gaza, which is on the news today, all the way up the coastline, all the way up past Tyre, all the way up to Zarephath. But it's good to get a feeling for that. And Gilead is over on the other side of the Jordan River. It's on the east side of the Jordan River. And this is the areas that God has given to modern Israel, and God is going to give to the final kingdom of Israel that we see in the book of Revelation. This is a physical kingdom. Now, there's a very interesting little verse here. And it says in verse 21, we're going to stop here and we're going to finish these verses and make some notes here. The deliverers will ascend Mount Zion. Now, Mount Zion is Jerusalem, right?
Yep.
To judge the mountain of Esau. That's in Edom. That's the mountain where they worshiped instead of coming up to Jerusalem to the temple. And the kingdom will be the Lord's. Now, this is where we get in, we don't have to look them up now, but in Matthew 3:2 and in Matthew 7:21, Jesus talks about his kingdom is coming. And his kingdom is going to be a kingdom on earth. He's the king of the Jews. That was written on the cross above him when he was crucified. And his kingdom in heaven, where he sits at the right hand of God, and he is given all the nations as his footstool, right?
Yeah.
So we can see when this little phrase of, and the kingdom is the Lord's, that's this promise again where the prophet is seeing right now in this current prophecy, and he's seeing the ultimate kingdom of the New Testament with Christ and the ultimate kingdom of the kingdom of heaven.
Okay.
So we see over and over again where these prophecies, you have to remember the perspective of the prophet who gets to see the events, but not the intervening valleys between them, like that illustration I showed. So this is current for us because there is a kingdom of Christ on earth right now. And Jesus is the king. And he reigns on earth right now through us. And he's going to be the king in the kingdom of heaven. So again, in the prophet, current events, Edom is going to be judged. Current events for now, the kingdom of Christ on earth and the kingdom of heaven coming in the last times. All being seen by Obadiah. And this observation. Now, I wanted to share a couple notes I made, and then we can talk about this a little bit. The first one is a quote from John Wolverd, who was the president of Dallas Theological Seminary. And he said, Obadiah presents a powerful message, and then I quoted it here. It shows what happens to those who reject God's word and his grace, rebelling in foolish pride. The one who spurns God's grace in pride has everything to lose, which is verse 18. They're going to be judged out of existence. There's a note there I would start to really help me think and help me meditate on Obadiah about my foolish pride. And maybe I need to do some confession of my foolish pride. Now then, I also wanted to read this other one. I need to be careful not to be arrogant about the political kingdom of Israel, but also not to be arrogant about the spiritual kingdom of Christ and reject the gospel of Christ for us. This judgment is God's final judgment, the millennial kingdom, that looks the same from the prophet's viewpoint. We just talked about that. The idea is in Obadiah, the promise is God will judge. So we need to choose deliverance and ask ourselves, am I part of the faithful remnant of verse 17? And then this last note by Walter Baker. This is from the Bible Knowledge Commentary. The one who responds to the grace of God has everything to gain. That's what Wolver said too. But a person who spurns his grace in pride has everything to lose. So choose between judgment and destruction and deliverance and salvation. And that's really the message of Obadiah for us. So we can take this dusty Old Testament prophet and really start to think about my attitude, not only towards Israel, but also towards the blessings that God has given, the blessings of his people, the blessings of his deliverance.
Yeah, that's great.
Now,
I like the modern day application.
When you read that last, did you get any observations from it? Anything strike you?
I thought one of the things that stood out was, number one, in the text, you see the finality of God's judgment and just the fact that he does keep his promises, whether it's promises of deliverance or judgment. So you see that in the text, but then you also see it in the evidence or the lack thereof, the fact that we don't see Edom, we don't see a people group there anymore.
No.
God's judgment, the prophecy came to pass. And so I think it's just, I like thinking about like the evidential side of the faith. And I think that just speaks to God's faithfulness to keep his promises, whether it's the judgment or the deliverance.
Yeah, you go to Petra and you see this fabulous culture and all these great carvings in the rocks and everything, and the people are gone. They're just not there anymore. And boy, I need to be careful to say, Lord, I want to be a faithful remnant who accepts your grace with gratitude and not with arrogance of an expectation of, he's got to bless me because I'm me.
Yeah.
God goes, oh yeah? So Obadiah can give us some pause and some thoughts. And I don't know about you, but I've really enjoyed this. I love taking a book that everybody goes, Obadiah. I've shared with people that I'm doing this study with you, studying Obadiah, and they go, Oba who? I've never heard of it, never studied it. And it's got a lot to say about our culture today. It's got a lot to say about current events, what's happening in Israel.
Yeah.
It's got a lot to say about the people of God. And I think we have every expectation biblically to expect a judgment on Hamas and even on Hezbollah, people that are arrogant towards the Jews and arrogant towards God's blessing of not only the Jews, but anyone who is faithful to his grace and accepts his grace. Thank you very much, Kyle, for helping this be a good discussion, a good study.
Yeah, thank you, Len.
Read slowly. Think about what it says to you, and God will bless you. And hopefully you'll choose deliverance rather than judgment. Today we've been talking about God's judgment and the fact that there is a faithful remnant who chooses to receive the grace of God's deliverance in the midst of that judgment. And we've seen that today. I hope it's been a blessing to you. I want to recommend one final video to you called Christ Followers' Freedom from Judgment. It's out of the book of Romans, and I think you'll find it a blessing. And listen, we're going to continue in another study next week. And until then, God bless you.